Hey guys, today I'm back in Kerbal Space Program and I want to try making a rocket using only monopropellant. Now it's normally just used for like RCS thrusters when trying to dock spaceships or doing something similar to that, so as a fuel source it tends to be really bad in comparison to liquid fuel, but I want to give it a shot to see if I can get something in orbit with it. So let's get right into it. So I'm loaded up into the sandbox now, and you see the first thing I'm doing is placing in a crew capsule. Now usually the next thing I do is just start slapping on some fuel tanks, but before I do that, I want to see which one of these is the most efficient, since I had a feeling this was going to be a real fight. Now to find the efficiency of a fuel tank, what I care about is the amount of energy the tank contains divided by the tank's weight. Now, since all these tanks are carrying the same type of fuel, the amount of energy they're storing is directly proportional to the amount of fuel they contain, so if I just swap out energy for fuel, now we have a useful equation. The game actually specifies both of these values for every tank in the editor, so now I can go through and just calculate the efficiency of every tank. After doing that, the first thing I noticed is that they're all really similar. Now, the small tanks tend to be a little worse, but otherwise I can't really go wrong here. So I'm just going to use the FL-R120 and the cylindrical tank throughout this video since they tend to be a good size for everything. So I just start by stacking on some of these FL-R120 tanks, but there is one thing I do here I want to point out. You see, after I add 4 tanks, I actually take them off the rocket and I hit Ctrl-Z. This replaces the tanks in the ship, but keeps the ones that are in my hand, so I can stack them on the bottom. So with this, I can effectively double anything I have, and you'll see it will be the source of a lot of pain in the future. But for now, works out quite well. And after I do that, next thing I want to do is just add on some engines and give it a shot. So ramp up the throttle and hit space to launch it. And it's not bad. No, it's bad. It doesn't go up very fast at all, and you can see here once it burns out, it gets up pretty high, but not that high. So to make it go a bit faster, what I want to do is double up the engines, and once I do that, now I have 16, and it should be a bit better. So ramp up the throttle again, turn on my stability control, and go straight up. But you can see with this rocket, after I go up high enough, I'm going up about 40,000 meters. And that didn't seem too bad at all. But there's nothing on this rocket yet, and I wanted to start putting on some payloads. And to do that, really I wanted to look at some mining equipment here because I was a little optimistic. I thought maybe there's a chance I could get on something where I could mine and then come home. But also I just wanted some sort of weight at the top, and it ended up working well to put there. So after I put down the refinery piece, I wanted to put down some solar panels to power it, but I put on these really large ones and they weren't great. But before I took them off, I put down some radiators on the refinery since I would need them. And after I did that, then I took off the massive solar panels since there was no way they were going to be aerodynamically good. And once I did that, I put down some of these smaller solar panels so you can see they look way better. So with those in place, I put down some landing gear as well. And after that, I put down a drill, and I accidentally put down the large drill because I wasn't paying enough attention. So it's way heavier than it needs to be, but I wanted to give it a shot to launch pad and see how it did. Now keep in mind here, I actually only have 8 of the engines. I got rid of 8 of them because I wanted to see how well it would do with just the original 8, and it's just not good. It's just staying on the launch pad. And you can see if I deploy the landing gear, I can actually get it to bounce into the air a little bit, and it seems like it's almost weightless once the boosters are going, but it's still just not quite able to start accelerating up. So I put down some more boosters like this, and after I did that, gave it another shot here, and it's going up, but it's nowhere near as fast as it was before. And it was burning through fuel super fast. So to fix that, you can see what I'm doing is just sneaking in some more fuel tanks like this, and I gave it another shot, and now going off the launch pad, it's even slower, but it ends up getting decently high before it runs out of fuel here. And you can see now it's actually only going up about 10,000 meters. So with all this weight, it's literally going a less than a quarter of the distance than it was before. So I removed the drill and I put on the lighter drill like this, and that should help out a lot. So I gave another test here, and you can see it starts to go up, and it's definitely better, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done here. Now that I at least know I can manage to lift this off the ground, I want to compare the available monopropellant engines to see which one is the best. Now to start building an efficiency equation, we can start with the obvious, and that's the more force it produces, the better. So to write this in a more equation-friendly form, I can write E, which is my efficiency equals N, or the force in newtons produced by the engine. Now there are a couple of other important factors though. The faster I consume fuel, the worse the engine is. Injecting this into the equation looks like this, where fuel consumed is in liters per second. Now, I don't like this double fraction thing going on though, so I'm just gonna move the seconds up top like this. Now, this is actually more than just a notational trick, since Newton seconds are units of impulse, which is change in momentum. So the efficiency unit is looking for the most amount of momentum an engine gives to the rocket with a certain amount of fuel. Now, I'm still ignoring the amount that the engines weigh, and to add that in, we can throw it on the bottom. So this means as an engine weighs more, the worse the efficiency, which makes sense. So to get this working, I just need to square the force term, and that's it. Now, I'm still missing a bit, but this is gonna get us in the ballpark for where we need to be. And here are the results, but they're actually not quite right. Now, the game gives mass values for a few of the smaller engines, but it actually doesn't calculate any mass or physics in practice, so that makes them really strong when compared to the larger Puff engine. But there's yet another issue that complicates things. The Puff engine can be controlled using normal rocket controls, which makes it way easier to use than any of the other engines here. Also, if I tried to use any of these boosters, I would need like hundreds of them, which would be not only tedious to place, but it would make the game very unstable, which already is going to be bad enough. So for these reasons, I just want to use the puff engine and not hate my life. Now I wanted to start adding some more stages to the rocket, so the first thing you see I'm doing here is putting on some decouplers on the sides, and I'm building up a bunch of fuel tanks in the bottom, and this is for the second stage. Once you do that, you see I'm putting some cones on the sides just to make it slightly more aerodynamic, and I'm putting on a bunch of these engines on the bottom. And once I had that, it looks pretty good, so I moved the whole thing up, and I was going to use my Control-C trick to copy everything over, but this actually caused it to crash. And I wasn't sure at the time why this happened, but I decided just to try it again. But this actually just made it crash, literally just copying fuel tanks. So I was playing it safe now, I was copying individual fuel tanks here, because I really didn't want to have another crash, and I wasn't even sure why they were happening. So you can see I'm recreating everything, I have a bunch of engines at the bottom once again, and I'm just copying the engines this time. And once I finished up that ring of engines, I wanted to try copying this over, but it's going to be a lot more careful this time. And to do that, I'm placing everything down, I'm waiting a ton of time before placing things down again, and it seemed to be pretty good, but when I tried copying these over, this ended up crashing. So I wasn't going to make you guys sit through it again, but I did manage to get all the engines on, and you can see here when I give it a test, it's actually really strong. In fact, the amount of thrust I was getting was crazy, but I guess that makes sense since now I have 8 of these banks of engines all together. Now the rocket itself wasn't that stable, and I had no aero parts on it, so it was sort of just wobbling all over the place, and it also did that, which is very cool. But also I noticed when I ran out of fuel, I was going to launch to the top stage just to try that one out, but I actually had no fuel in the stage at all. It seemed like the bottom stage must have burned through all the fuel of the top stage, which is weird because normally liquid fuel engines specifically don't do that. So the first issue I wanted to tackle here was the weird wobbling. So to do that, I just turned on auto strut and put it on a bunch of the parts towards the bottom. And once I did that, it seemed to be a lot better. It still wasn't perfect, but it was doing much better. But you can see here when I try to turn, it still ends up just flopping over. But this one's actually just because I have no wings or anything on it to stabilize it. So that's what I'm doing here. I went for some small ones, probably too small, but I didn't want to go too big because I really didn't want to weigh this down all that much, and it seemed fine this way. And also what I'm doing is changing the flow priority of a bunch of these tanks. Now the flow priority, basically all it does is a higher number will drain that tank first. So I have all of the initial stage set, so it's the highest priority, so the boosters drain all of their fuel first, and once those fuel tanks drop, I can let them go and then just have the fuel left in the middle tank. Now this is working here, you can see the boosters were actually draining, but the small tank was not. And as I went up higher and higher, I actually made the mistake of burning a little bit too long, and I started burning into the fuel in my top rocket. So I do have to be a little careful that I don't burn too much fuel, and I actually have to keep an eye on that. And it's a little annoying, but honestly, it's not the end of the world. Now I wanted to add on a bit more fuel as well, since I burned through that really fast, and to do that, instead of just stacking more tanks, which was causing the rocket to be very wobbly, what I wanted to do is add on a bunch of these cylindrical tanks and completely surround the rocket like this. Now after I did that, I tried copying it over, and I was very brave to do this because I thought it might crash, and it actually did. After loading back in, I did actually manage to copy 4 tanks all at once, which was amazing. But for some reason, I didn't save and also got greedy and wanted to do 6, and that crashed it. So I was thinking, actually, I wanted to try a different design because that was kind of annoying, and I had an idea. What if every single fuel tank was itself its own stage? So every time I burn through a fuel tank, I can just drop it and have a really efficient rocket that way. So that's exactly what I have here, and in fact, I'm using a stacked tri-coupler, so I have 3 of these sets here, so I can just drop 3 at a time and also get a lot more fuel out of this. And here you can see I'm putting down a bunch of these puff engines as well, and I was sort of just completely surrounding it. I had no idea how many I wanted, and it just seemed like a lot was good. Unfortunately, I did need to put them at the top though, which is going to make stability really, really bad, but otherwise they would just drop off with the other fuel tanks as they fell off, so I had really no choice but to put them at the top of the rocket. And here you can see the fuel tanks drained super fast, but I could just drop them one by one, and in theory it'll be really, really good. So the first few stages you can see here at 3 times speed. It's not bad, it's picking up speed pretty well, but this really shines as I start going to the top and shedding almost all of my weight. So here you can see this normal speed. You can see I'm just sort of punching it, and it just goes faster and faster and faster as more of these tanks fall. We're already up over about 1,000 meters per second, and you can see the atmosphere is not really happy about it. I'm not really high up enough to really be enjoying this speed properly. So with the final stage going, I'm just sort of hoping for the best, and I was honestly expecting to explode here. Thankfully it didn't, and I almost got 2 kilometers per second. And you can see here I have an apoapsis of about 370,000 meters, and that was a lot. But this rocket actually still wasn't quite enough to get into orbit. but I wanted to try adding some fins to see how good of an orbit I could get out of this. But the problem is, whenever I try to turn, it's so bottom heavy because the fuel tanks I have to have there, it just flips over. And I tried a whole bunch of stuff, including adding some structural fuselages and some other stuff to distribute weight better, but it didn't help. I ended up flipping right over, and I had to scrap that. And I went back to my original rocket here, and I wanted to add another stage, and this one should be enough to get me all the way into orbit. So I'm back to the rocket I was using before, and you can see here what I'm doing is putting on some more decouplers because I want to add on one more stage to this. And you'll see I'm very carefully placing fuel tanks because I really don't want it to crash, because I was getting very sick of that. So I put down some more nose cones, angled them in. After I did that, next thing I did was copied over some engines, and I was a little worried about copying here, but I learned a few tricks to make it somewhat bearable. So it seems like when I copy, as long as I don't click anything, the game tends to not crash. It sometimes still does, but it's much less common. Another trick is that once I copy something, I should place it down first, because then it seems to behave a little bit better. For whatever reason, if I put it right on the craft, it doesn't like that, and then it just causes the game to crash. But here you can see I got 4 boosters in place, and I actually have 5 banks of rockets on all of these, so it should be plenty powerful here. After that, you can see here I'm putting down some very large wings, put down some of these Elevon parts to give myself a little bit of control once I'm in the air, and with that, decided to load in and give it a shot. So the launch pad looked awesome, and I hit space, and it accidentally became a decoupler test. That's fine, decoupler looks good. After that, it's to launch away and everything, so I guess that's fine. But after I fixed the decoupler issue, gave it an actual test now, and tried to get it into the air. So what I was really looking for here is to make sure all the cross feeds were working properly, and to make sure that all the things were deploying properly and nothing was interfering. So, gave it a shot now, and actually there's 2 problems. You can see that all the boosters in the bottom are doing that. And the monopropellant is not draining properly. It's actually not taking from the small boosters, it's taking from the second stage. So I'm gonna need to fix that so that the staging actually works properly there. So since the boosters weren't working quite right, I just decided to keep using the first stage of the rocket until I ran through both the second and first stage worth of fuel. But actually, before I could even get through all that fuel, the random movement of all the boosters managed to cause this to completely flip over, and there was nothing I could do to fix that. So I decided I might as well just still test the decouplers now, and I threw out the bottom boosters, and they seemed to work fine. They kind of exploded, but nothing seemed to explode on my actual ship, so I guess it was okay. I decided to start this one up, and you can see full fuel, and everything looks pretty good. And I decided to follow this one all the way until it landed, and you can see here, even though it slammed into the ground, the crew capsule is actually fine. I have no idea how that survived the impact, but it was funny enough I had to show it. So, with that done, I wanted to give it an actual test here, and you can see I'm starting out, launching the bottom boosters. And right now I have the cross feeds all fixed, so it should be draining properly. So the bottom boosters going, you can see they don't actually go up that high before they're already completely out of fuel. Now, the second stage doesn't launch immediately. I actually need to press space again to get the boosters to go. Why did I do this? Mostly because I just didn't stage it properly. But also, I was a little worried that once I was going to start this up, it might cause some problems with colliding into other stuff if I have it go at the same time. So I decided instead make it a separate stage. I shouldn't lose too much fuel doing it this way, but you see here, I launched the top stage of the rocket after that, and it's not too bad. It's actually going pretty well, but I have a kind of a garbage turn here for getting into an orbit, mainly because I wasn't paying enough attention to what I was doing, so I was just trying to make sure all the staging was properly done, and also that the cross feeds were looking good. And you can see here, I'm really starting to build my apoapsis, and it's not too bad, but already I ran out of fuel. So basically what I want to do to get a little bit further, since I'm pretty close to orbit already, is actually just add a little bit more fuel to that bottom stage, since it burned out really fast. So to do that, I'm just stacking on more tanks, and you can see I'm doing it very carefully. I'm trying not to copy and paste too much. Once I do that, you can see here I'm copying back on the engine clusters, and I was just gonna give this a quick test here, and I realized something interesting. I stopped the engines temporarily and put them back up to full thrust, and this compressed the fuel tanks in a way that just caused them to lose all stability, and the bottom stage of the rocket literally just became like spaghetti or something. It was a complete disaster. But even in this test, you can see here, I got a pretty solid orbit going. It was already 85,000 meters, which was way better than before. So with that done, I wanted to focus on the top stage of the rocket and actually add on one tiny stage on the top. So to do that, you can see here, I have 3 fuel tanks, and I'm putting some monopropellant engines on the bottom like this. After I do that, I'm also putting on some docking ports, so that in the future I'll be able to save Bill. And once I do that, I reattached everything, but I actually didn't really like the mining part being there since I wasn't using it anyway. So what I did is add in a decoupler and put the rocket on the bottom of the first stage like this. And now with the combination of the top stage and the loss of mining equipment, I should be way lighter and be able to get out of the atmosphere. So I gave it a test here. I just wanted to make sure the top stage was deploying properly. And you can see here, once I run out of fuel in the second to last stage, I decouple. And once I do this, you can see I can start the last stage up, and seems to work out fine. Still gaining some speed, so that should be good. And now here for the final test. Really, I didn't make any changes. I added a few more fuel tanks to the bottom stage, but other than that, really nothing changed. And you can see I'm starting out by trying to get up a as high as I can. Now, this rocket is very awkward, and I have to very carefully watch the monopropellant, and I'm going to be showing that at the top here. So after the first stage basically ran out, I had 1.72 units of monopropellant left. I wasn't going to try to use a little bit of extra monopropellant there, so I just dropped it to the ground and started up the second stage. Now, the second stage was the most unstable. You can see here how much it's wobbling back and forth, and I probably could have tuned this a bit more, but the problem is really just that these tanks are so disjointed from each other that they just like to wobble a lot. So it wasn't really that big of a deal. I could still angle it roughly where I wanted it to go, and the stage ended up almost completely draining in a good amount of time. Once it did, I just dropped it off and launched up the third stage. Now, even this stage had some oscillating issues, but it was totally flyable, and I could still manage to point it pretty much exactly where I needed it to go. After this, it was pretty much just a waiting game of making sure that I'm using all of my fuel that I can. Once I got pretty much all the way down, I turned down the throttle and just barely nudged it. Once I did this, you can see the monopropellant slowly goes down. I got it to about 0 units, and I used almost none of the monopropellant in the very top stage. After that, I launched it, and it looks like there's a lot for this little stage to do, but this stage is so efficient since it weighs like nothing that it pretty much could just complete this no problem. So you can see here I'm extending on my apoapsis, and I'm actually looking pretty good. I'm actually angling slightly down as well to keep the apoapsis from expanding out a ton, and once I do this, you can see I get it to wrap all the way around, and I technically have a complete orbit, but it's not out of the atmosphere quite yet. And there's really nothing for me to do until I fly around to the other side, so I have to fly in the atmosphere for a little while, but you can see here I eventually warp all the way around, and I warp to the apoapsis, and once I do that, I still have 300 meters per second to delta V, which is plenty for me to finish off the circularization. So I just wrap around again, and you can see here I managed to get the periapsis and apoapsis within 100 meters of each other. Did I need to do this? No, but it's just gonna make it slightly easier for me in the future when I want to get someone to dock with this, and I'll probably have someone save Bill at the very end of another recovery mission. So guys, thanks for watching. This video was a lot of fun to make. It was definitely a pretty good challenge, and a lot of the challenges were not for reasons I was expecting. So if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below, and otherwise, until next time.